on already. So I'll just say, look, he's Chief Executive of...
There are two parts to my presentation. The second part is... There's two parts to my presentation. The second part deals with the scientific basis for focusing on increased grazed grass utilisation within Irish farm systems. But as part of the overall presentation, I felt I had to go back a step and start with the story of we're looking at higher stocking rate systems now on farms. We've been looking at that for a number of years in research studies, and I suppose the approach we take to looking at higher stocking rates and to trying to increase grass utilizations in our systems, it's really important that we have a very clear kind of decision-making approach to increasing grass utilization. So that's what the first part of the presentation is about. In terms of overview, I'm going to describe for you why you need to consider the important implications of integrated grazing systems. Grass-based systems are integrated. Why is that important for you? We're going to look at some commercial farm data, and then we're going to look at the scientific results in terms of growth, quality, utilization and efficiency, and some conclusions and implications to finish off. So this is probably my most important slide. I suppose there's two types of systems. You can look at systems from two perspectives. There are systems that are non-integrated, that is, the components within the system aren't related. So it's a kind of a pick and mix type system where you can, take a certain type of cow, maybe choose a certain level of supplementation, maybe a certain type of capital investment program and so on, and that the different decisions you make aren't actually related. But if there's one fundamental thing you need to be aware of is that grazing systems are absolutely integrated. That is to say that every single decision you make on a grazing dairy farm has implications for other aspects of that production system. So that's the first thing. So be very clear and very careful about the choices you make and the unintended consequences of making the wrong choices. I suppose, from my point of view, the big enemy for dairy farmers looking at the next number of years is confusion. And, farmers are busy, farms are busy places, there's lots of information coming at you, and it's having a kind of a clear kind of a set of decision rules in your mind for what are you interested in, what's important to your business, and then what are the other things that you need to get off the table that have no place in terms of an integrated grass-based system. So that's really what this slide is about. And I suppose in recent years, farmers have got very good at integrating the type of animal and grass-based system. So we're now very clear that we need a highly compact calving, high EBI dairy animal in a grazing system. So we've linked those two things and we're making consistent choices in those two steps. But there are other examples where we're not so consistent in terms of the choices we make, and it has got damaging implications for grass-based production in the future. The next thing I want to say about this is that I suppose being fortunate to work in Moore Park, there's lots of information coming across our screens every day from other research centres and different experiments and so on. And you need to be absolutely clear that grass-based, well-implemented grass-based systems are vastly superior to any other system that you could potentially implement on your farm over the next 5 to 10 years. From an economic point of view, from a biological efficiency point of view, from an environmental point of view, and from a social point of view. So, and I don't make that statement lightly, that we do not come across other systems that are outperforming grazing systems. So we need to be very clear that if we can implement these systems really well, then we're onto a winner in terms of producing milk profitably in the future. I want to show two examples of where farmers might make choices that are not consistent with what's important for a grazing system. And I've just taken one historical example and one maybe more recent example. The first one you're very familiar with. I've just put up a graph there showing the decline in calving interval on Irish dairy farms during the years from 1980 through to 2000, the pre-EBI years. And we're all well aware now that farmers during that time made a decision to select for a higher yield type cow. Now, on its own, in a non-integrated system, that's a great idea. We're increasing milk production, having animals with higher milk production, that's brilliant. But unfortunately, in a grazing system, because it's integrated, the poor fertility of those animals, because they couldn't sustain their performance in a grass-based environment, meant that their fertility declined with huge detrimental impacts on grass utilization and ultimately on farm profitability. So here's an example of making a choice that's not consistent with high grass utilization and profitable milk production in dairying. To take a more recent example, and thinking of the wider then factors to consider in a grazing system, this is a report that's actually just released today. It's a Bank of Ireland Teagasc report on investment behaviour on Irish farms in recent years. And this is specifically looking at the dairy farms, Irish dairy farms. What have they invested in over the last 7 or 8 years? And it shows actually, well, it's surprising to me maybe, but maybe not to other people, that the vast majority of investments on Irish farms in the last 7 or 8 years have been in the form of buildings and machinery. Now, these are two things that you would not consider to be fundamental to a grazing system. If you think of the wider benefits of grazing, it confers on us the need for less capital investment in fixed infrastructure, in fixed costs. And that allows you then to focus on grass production, grass utilisation, minimise your fixed costs, and then dilute your overall costs for more profitable milk production. There's evidence that farmers are investing too heavily, in my mind at least, in terms of fixed infrastructure. If you go for fixed infrastructure, that expense that's not discretionary. You can't turn around in a low milk price year and remove that expense. It's there. So as a grazing dairy farmer, you have to minimise that cost. Consistent with grazing systems is focusing investments on areas that are productive in grazing. Growing more grass, better swards, drainage, those kind of aspects, rather than on buildings and machinery. I suppose what's the general point? The general point I want to make is that you're busy dairy farmers, you need to be clear about what you're considering in terms of your systems looking ahead. There's going to be lots of information coming at you in terms of marginal and economic analysis. Use this, it can boost this by so much and so on. There's lots of these things, and you need to be very careful about the choices you make. I suppose what I would urge you to do is to make an overall plan. The beauty of making an overall business plan in terms of laying down all your targets, like we heard from the farmers earlier, that you can look at the choices you're making in terms of cow type, in terms of grazing practices, in terms of things like stocking rates and supplementary feed levels, in terms of things you're planning to invest capital in, and then also looking at things you're measuring. What are your goals in terms of biological indicators, but also in terms of financial indicators? And at least then, by writing that plan down, you can see the inconsistencies. You can see the confusion that you're actually putting on the page in front of you. And with your discussion group, you can kind of iron out the things that are really, really important. In an integrated grazing system, all the choices you make across the spectrum of things that I've listed here have to be consistent in order for you to be a very profitable dairy farmer in the future. I suppose from a grazing perspective then, to bring it back to grass utilisation, it gets a little bit more complicated. We know that with quotas going, farmers want to increase milk production, and it's natural that you would look at affording animals increased feed allowances as a way to increase milk production in the future. And whether that feed is coming from grazed grass, extra grazed grass allowed on the farm, or whether it's coming from some supplementary feeds included in the system, I suppose there's a couple of things you need to be aware of. The green line shows you the relationship between grass dry matter intake and feed allowance being on the horizontal axis. And you can see that as feed allowance increases moving from left to right, grass dry matter intake actually increases. This is the yellow line, that I'm talking about. But you can see that there's diseconomies of scale, so that for every extra kilo of feed that's allocated to the individual animal, the extra dry matter intake is only marginally increasing. This is the challenge for grazing systems. It's difficult to increase feed allowance in a grazing system and to still achieve the targets which are represented by the green line to utilise the feed efficiently. When you increase feed supplementation in a grazing system, actually the utilisation rate tends to decline. In fact, it declines reasonably linearly. And I suppose what this means is then, in terms of the choice you're making about a system in future and the allocation rate to individual animals, you have to balance the two competing objectives. You want to feed animals well, absolutely, to get high animal performance, but by the same token, we're talking about the importance of grass utilisation to the profitability of your business. You have to utilise grass very, very efficiently on farms. So I suppose it's very, very important to balance those two objectives in terms of the choice of system as quotas, with quotas out of the picture. In that regard then, the choice of stocking rate should be based on achieving those two objectives still, that animals are capable of relatively high individual animal performance at whatever stocking rate you choose, but also that you are utilising a lot of feed in the system. So again, that competing objective has to be recognised. I suppose in terms of understanding how this works on farms, I'm going to put some commercial farm data before you. This is data from the top 10% of dairy farmers who are competing management accounts. It's data between the years 2008 and 2011, so years that would, to my mind, be very similar to what we might expect for the next 4 or 5 years in terms of milk prices, climate and so on. I think it's directly relevant to what might happen on your farms. It looks at different systems of production from system 2 on the left-hand side, where there's a relatively low level of supplementary feed input, less than 10% of the total feed in the diet is coming from off-farm sources, right across to systems 5 on the right-hand side, where greater than 34% of the feed is coming from off-farm sources. So a much higher supplemental system. Now let's just look at how well, over those 4 years, these really, really good dairy farmers have managed to incorporate extra supplements in their grass-based dairy systems. The first thing that might surprise you is that stocking rate actually doesn't tend to increase when you increase supplementary feed inputs. So from a theoretical point of view, immediately we say, well, okay, that's a bit of a contradiction. We should expect stocking rate to jump with these extra supplements. It doesn't tend to happen in practice. That's number one. The second thing, which is probably more alarming, and it kind of relates to what Colin said earlier about if there's feed in the yard, we're inclined to use it rather than, focus on grazing. Actually, grazing season lengths tend to shorten on farms that were using more supplements. So that's directly opposite to what you might expect. You would imagine with more supplementation, you should be able to extend the grazing season. In fact, it's the opposite that happens. So from a business focus point of view, whether it be for whatever reason, farmers that are tending to incorporate more supplements into grass-based diets tend to focus less on grazing, and they ended up with a shorter grazing season. As a consequence of that, forage utilised on their farms tended to decline from 8.5 tonnes down to 6.8. We know this is going to be very important in terms of the financial results, and that forage utilisation was replaced with the supplementary feed coming in. Unfortunately, from my point of view, I suppose, but it's part of the scientific problem, is that milk solids production increases in higher supplementation systems. And because farmers typically judge what's happening in terms of milk supplies as an indicator of how well they're implementing some practice, for those farmers in systems 4 and 5 on the right-hand side, initially they probably recognize the extra milk production and say, well, okay, this seems to be working. Let's just pause judgment on that until we look at the financials. The final part is the financials. Total cost of production increase with increased supplementary feeding on dairy farms. The more feed that's going in, the higher is the cost of feeds, but in fact also other costs tend to increase as well. So that for every euro that was spent on feed on these farms on the right-hand side, in fact total costs increased by €1.60. So there was a bigger increase in total costs associated with the other costs, whether it be fixed infrastructure and so on within those systems. Ultimately, moving to those higher supplement, higher risk systems, those farmers were rewarded with a lower actual profit per hectare than farmers who didn't include the supplement in the system. The summary is, supplementation of grazing is an incredibly difficult thing to do. Biologically, you're trying to work against all the laws that happen at farm level. You need to be very careful when you're talking about using supplements to build milk production as part of an expanding business. The data suggests that the best dairy farmers actually find it really difficult to do, and they get no economic return from doing so. So with that in mind, let's focus on grass utilisation as an alternative source of feed to support higher stocking rates post-quotas. We're absolutely clear that as farmers, one of the beautiful things about grass utilisation is that it's a biological variable that's relatively easy to measure at farm level, and that it's actually really closely linked with farm profits. As farmers increase grass utilisation, and any choices they make to increase grass utilisation, they increase the profitability of their businesses. And that's a linear relationship exactly the same as Colin showed for New Zealand. I suppose the second thing to say then is in terms of increasing stocking rate then, what are you really doing? Well, I'd like you to start looking at stocking rate as a form of an efficiency. Can you carry more cows on your farm? Yes, maybe we can. But if we're going to do that, we have to provide the feed in the form of grazed grass within that system to meet the requirements of those cows, and therefore to be profitable at a higher level of scale or expansion and so on. So it comes with, unfortunately, a set of rules and a big challenge for you as dairy farmers. For those considering carrying more cows per hectare on farms, to me there's 3 things to consider. The farm needs to grow more, the quality of the feed on the farm needs to be higher to support the extra number of animals, increased grass utilisation has to be achieved, it needs to be converted efficiently to milk production, and finally then, the final kicker is that supplementation, or by its other name, fertiliser inputs, shouldn't be increasing in line with the extra stocking rate. Because really, if it's a form of efficiency based on grass utilisation, it doesn't necessitate extra fertiliser and feed inputs. So it's an efficiency gain associated with extra grass utilisation. So that's a pretty tall challenge to put in front of anyone. But that's nonetheless what I would say is the clear focus that you need to have if you want stocking rate to be associated with higher profits on your farms in the future. Moving on to the Curtins experiment, this is a 4-year farm systems experiment. The way that the experiment is run, it's run like a dairy farm. We try to integrate components. We try to make it look like the results look like what should happen on a farm run over that period. So it's a long-term experiment. I put a tagline in here just kind of to remind myself mainly of what the overall objective was. If dairy farmers are interested in increasing stocking rate to expand their farm businesses profitably, they need to develop consistent grazing practices that are capable of increased production, quality and utilisation of grass to support increased feed requirements post-quotas and at higher stocking rates. So that's kind of like the background story behind what we're doing in these higher stocking rate experiments. Very quickly, we're talking about a site that's operating at the highest soil fertility level. So it's at optimum soil fertility in terms of lime, PK. Basically, if you look at the P and K levels, it's index 4 for P, it's index 3 for K. In terms of the right-hand side of that table, we're allocating, since the Nitrates Directive, 250 kilos of N per hectare per year being applied, small amounts of P and K, mainly going out on reseeded area. We're reseeding about 10% of the area each year. So the nutrient application rate hasn't changed. It's exactly the same for all the stocking rates that I'll show. The treatments that we compared over those 4 years are 2.5 cows per hectare, 2.9 cows per hectare, and 3.3 cows per hectare. So these are at the higher end of stocking rates that are on commercial dairy farms at this stage, equivalent to feed allowances of 6.7, 5.8, and 5.2 tons of feed available per animal. So these are, less feed available per animals, we're increasing stocking rate, or equivalent to comparative stocking rate in Collins terms of 85, 95, and approximately 105 at the high stocking rate. Because it's an integrated system, we have changed the grazing severities in association with the change in stocking rate. So at low stocking rate, we have a lax grazing approach, 4.5 to 5 centimetres. It's very similar to Colin's outline earlier. When stocking rate is lower, the focus is more on the individual animals. So the requirement for low grazing intensities or severe grazing are less. Therefore, we implemented laxer grazing in those systems. By the other extreme, at higher stocking rate, we put in a more extreme grazing practice, consistently grazing to 3.5 to 4 centimetres to utilise extra feed within an environment where feed is limited. The stocking rates were ran independently. I'd have to be totally upfront with you. If there was a criticism you would make of this experiment right now, it is that we probably optimised the low stocking rates too well, as in they are all optimised systems. So that some of the results I'll show you actually probably don't arise at farm level because of the detrimental impact of lower stocking rates on commercial farms. Just to give you a picture of what happens in terms of detailed measurements, I suppose there's a whole load of feed budgets, rotation plans, spring rotation plans, and so on behind this. But in principle, what's happening here is that at higher stocking rates, we have consistently imposed an increased grazing severity. As reflected at the bottom of that graph there, the higher stocking rate has a lower post-grazing residual all year long. So in springtime, it's quite low at around 3 centimetres, increasing to 3.5 in mid-season. By comparison, the low stocking rates have a laxer grazing intensity, particularly in mid-season. So that's to allow the individual animal at lower stocking rate to express their potential to a greater extent. You can see also from the top 3 lines in the graph, those are the pre-grazing herbage masses that we're allowing, we're building up higher pre-grazing herbage masses through the year in accordance with the feed budgets, so that at higher stocking rates, we're not compromising the supply of grass to the dairy herd. In pictorial form, what does 3.5 centimetres look like? Well, this is an example of what it looks like in springtime. So animals grazing 3.5 centimetres are removing all the pasture that's available to them. And for farmers looking at the experiment over the last number of years, they wouldn't be comfortable probably with this level of grazing intensity. It's quite severe. I suppose to reassure you in terms of what's happening, it's to utilise all the grass that's available. We are consistently imposing the grazing residual, so it's all green leaf that's regrowing from that height. And because it's a consistent practice, the sward becomes accustomed to it, so that it's not so detrimental as might happen on a farm which just implemented this for the first time. Milk production benefits. I can guarantee you that when you increase stocking rate, you will lift milk production. There's absolutely no doubt about that per hectare. I suppose where the trick comes here is that in a system at higher stocking rates, you actually have to put more pressure on animals to graze out, to increase utilisation. Utilising more feed is very, very important. So individual animal performance will actually have to decline from the optimum level that that animal is capable of in order to maximise the efficiency of the overall system. In these experiments over the 4 years, you can see milk solids production, fat and protein per cow, declined from 457 down to 408. But nonetheless, these are very high levels of milk solids production in comparison with what farmers achieved. So we are still producing very high milk output per animal. It's just slightly lower than the optimum what that animal is capable of. On a per hectare basis, which has to be the focus post-quotas, per hectare, milk solids production increased within these studies as we went for higher stocking rates. And because we didn't increase supplementary feed inputs or fertilizer inputs, that is a consequence of extra grazed grass utilization. So the systems are deriving extra milk solids production from grazed grass. Grass growth. On average over the 4-year period, grass growth was higher for the higher stocking rates by in the order of magnitude of 1 tonne of dry matter per hectare. So within these optimized systems, even with the best optimized low stocking rate system, we managed to increase grass growth on average over the 4-year period by 1 tonne of dry matter per hectare at high stocking rate. The other thing you notice from the diagram is that I'm showing you here each year, and you can see that in the first 2 years of the studies, 2009 and 2010, there wasn't a big benefit to the higher stocking rates in grass growth. So there's 2 things happening there. The first thing is that, well, 2009 and 2010 were not particularly good years in grass growth terms, so that's the first thing. It doesn't always happen. That's the nature of working with a grazing system. The second thing to say, though, is that the beneficial effects of the higher stocking rates were realised in the later years of the study, because there is plenty of evidence that swards condition over time, that by implementing the same consistent grazing practices over a prolonged period, you will get beneficial effects on swards. Just like farmers, just like cows, swards adopt and adjust to grazing pressure, and consequently you get higher productivity in the longer term. So investment in more detailed grazing measurement, it's a long-term investment in terms of realising extra productivity from a farm. Sward quality is obviously beneficial when you increase grazing severity. I don't think anyone's going to argue with the science. I suppose what we saw in the experiment was the sward quality of all treatments was high, because at low stocking rate, we're just harvesting all that material as silage, that extra material. Whereas at high stocking rate, the animal is doing all of the work. There's no mechanical correction of these swards. They're either grazed or they're harvested for silage. The big thing we noticed was, though, that in terms of grass quality in the first half of the year, in the period of the year where it's not possible to use silage conservation to correct poor grazing practices, higher stocking rates consistently provided high quality grass, whereas lower stocking rates and lax grazing reduced grass quality out into mid-season. So that's the benefit in terms of providing animals with higher quality diet out to the first half of the year. Higher stocking rates and grazing consistently at a more severe intensity does improve sward quality. Grazing efficiency is the next slide. It just shows you the proportion of the feed that was provided to the animals, what percentage of it was actually utilised. So from our terms, 3.5 centimetres is 0. Animals aren't routinely going below that, and it's of the feed supplied above 3.5 centimetres, what percentage of it is removed by the animals. And you can see that the higher stocking rates are consistently removing more because we're grazing more severely. Every time you leave a centimetre of dry matter above 3.5 centimetres in a paddock, you are leaving 250 kilos of dry matter per hectare in that paddock behind you. So in a high stocking rate context, if that feed isn't used, that has to be found elsewhere. So where are you going to get that extra feed? Is it a supplement? Is it somewhere else? Or are you going to have to carry a lower stocking rate ultimately? I suppose the other lesson we learned from the experiments is we were able to graze lower in the early part of the season. So we managed to graze these swards down without any great difficulty to 3 centimetres, just over 3 centimetres in the first rotation, February and March. And I suppose the thing we learned from that is that at higher stocking rate, that's hugely beneficial. 20% of the feed was coming from under the 3.5 centimetre height at high stocking rate in springtime. When you're looking at higher stocking rates, you're looking for feed. There is relatively high quality feed available low in the sward horizon in springtime, and you should be used in higher stocking rate systems. During the main grazing season, when the lax grazing intensity of 4.5 centimetres were applied to the low stocking rate, you can see there that grazing efficiency was reduced to about 75%. So lax grazing, very detrimental in terms of harvesting the material that's available to animals. Bringing it all together then, in terms of the total numbers, what's happening? Well, I mentioned earlier, a tonne of extra dry matter harvested or grown per hectare, at the higher stocking rate, 15.4 tonnes on average over that 4-year period versus 14.4 for the low stocking rate. In terms of herbage utilisation, grazed grass, there was extra grazed grass utilised by the higher stocking rates. You have a higher demand all the time, so therefore you utilise more. Conversely, grass silage tends to be higher at low stocking rate, so if you're if you're measuring feed budgeting and so on and removing surpluses efficiently, lower stocking rates tend to remove more surpluses. That's not that surprising. And in total then there was about half a tonne of benefit in terms of total grass utilised per hectare at the high stocking rate. Correcting for the energy value then of that, the superior digestibility and quality of the higher stocking rate swards, we were back up to about 1,000 UFLs, or the equivalent of approximately, it's about 140 gigajoules of ME per hectare versus about 120 gigajoules of ME per hectare was the difference between the low and high stocking rates in terms of total energy utilization. So big benefits in terms of supplying extra feed from within the system realized in the higher stocking rate group consistently over the 4-year period. The fourth part of the jigsaw in terms of feeding animals at higher stocking rates is actually feed allowance. Feed allowance will tend to decrease when you go for higher stocking rates. That's just because feed is less available to individual animals. In our study, over those 4 years, feed allowance per animal was reduced by about 27% relative to the low stocking rate treatment, which seems like a huge drop in terms of feed availability to the individual animal. I suppose what you need to remember, though, is the quality of that feed that was supplied to those animals was greater, and consequently, the energy-corrected dry matter intake of the high stocking rate was only reduced by about 13%. Very similar to the reduction in milk production. So while we restricted access to feed, the quality of the feed that was available to the animals was higher, and consequently the reduction in milk production was not so severe. And that's where the benefit, that's the fourth part of the feed budget for a higher stocking rate system. Conclusions: significantly increased milk solids production at higher stocking rate in terms of milk solids per hectare. Huge benefit can be realised at dairy farms post-quota. Based on similar fertilizer and feed inputs. So the big if, can we do it without extra inputs from outside the system? And consequently, because we were able to utilise more grass with the same level of inputs, it was actually a more efficient system from an environmental point of view as well as from a biological point of view. So all the environmental measurements that are in the system actually show a positive gain from a higher stocking rate. Grazed grass production, utilisation and quality improved as stocking rate increased. We got benefits in all 3 areas by having a higher stocking rate and implementing a more consistently, a more severe grazing intensity. And the final part was the 4 contributions in terms of the changes in the farm system that met the feed requirements of animals at higher stocking rate. By implementing the grazing practices consistently, more detailed measurement and feed budgeting, focus on rotation lengths and so on, grass growth increased, feed quality was improved, increased utilisation of the feed that was supplied, and fourthly, the individual reduction in individual feed allowance to the individual animal. That's the 4 parts that made up the feed budget of the higher stocking rate treatments in our experience from this study. I suppose more generally then, looking in terms of concluding remarks for farmers and I suppose making decisions about quotas going, the first thing to say is that grass-based farms are integrated. All the decisions you make across a wide variety of things, whether it be the cow type, whether it be the choice of what you invest in looking ahead, the type of supplement levels and so on, they need to be consistent with growing and utilising more grass on your farm. The evidence shows you that more supplements, the wrong type of cow, all of these things have significantly damaging impacts on grass utilisation. Grazed grass utilisation is the only factor that closely reflects profitability. It's measured in tonnes of dry matter per hectare, so you need to grow more in order to utilise more, and you need to have grazing practices that are more focused then in terms of utilising that extra grass. So more discipline in terms of extra grazing management practices will be required to support higher stocking rates. Finally then, in terms of optimum stocking rates from a biological perspective, I don't think farmers should be looking at stocking rate as something that changes from year to year or something that changes based on milk price. You're doing this for the next 5 years. We don't know what the milk price will be. So on that basis, the stocking rate is a biological decision. The biological decision is that it should be linked closely to grass growth and grass utilisation. If we take farms that are growing 14 tonnes of dry matter per hectare, for example, and feeding less than 500 kilos of supplement, the optimum stocking rate is probably around 2.5 cows per hectare for that system. That you will utilise fully the feed and get relatively high individual animal performance. I suppose the counterpoint to that is that there are many discussion groups now thinking about the 3 cow per hectare limit, that they're looking at that on their milking platform. That's fine, but be very aware that you need to be growing 16 tonnes of dry matter, feeding less than 500 kilos of supplement per animal to feed animals efficiently and profitably at 3 cows per hectare. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Super, Brendan. Thank you. We'll take questions at this stage. Maybe to kick it off for both of you, which do you do first? Do you grow more grass and realise you have surplus around the place? Or do you put the stocking rate on to help you grow more surplus? So, Colin, you take over a new farm. What do? How do you set it up? Allow now will say that you don't know how much it's growing. And then questions, please.
So certainly when we're looking at a new farm purchase or a conversion, we will already have an idea of what the farm is capable of achieving. There's plenty of data that's available around New Zealand in terms of similar soil types, rainfalls, fertility levels, to know what production levels can be achieved. And then it's just a matter of being able to ensure we know what the limiting factors are on that farm, correcting those as quickly as possible, and then stepping up stocking rate as aggressively as quickly as we possibly can to ensure we are able to harvest that pasture that the farm should then be capable of growing. I guess the key thing though is sometimes there can be a lead-in period of time, particularly if you're taking over properties that have, whether they've been cropped aggressively in the past, or in many cases in New Zealand, there are a number of pastures that are being developed out of forestry. The underlying soil fertility levels there can be very low, and there is a need to build up biological activity in the soils as well as lifting nutrient status as well. So sometimes there's a bit of a lead-in that's required. So it means, yes, we've got a view for what the farms can carry, and equally we'll form a view very quickly of how long it'll take us to get to those optimised stocking rates.
I'll go to a question rather than follow up, and I'll hold the Brendan and come back.
Yeah, Chairman, to Brendan, in the high stocking rate, did you look at was there any impact on the fertility and the fertility performance of the herd?
Yeah.
Relative to, we'll say, the 2 point?
Yeah. We looked at all the reproductive measurements over those 4 years. I suppose the only things that stood out is that certainly when you go for higher stocking rates, the anestrus, particularly in young animals, the level of non-cycling animals does increase at the start of the breeding period, and we did have to go in and do more treatments with those young animals. Now, it's a small population, obviously, so these are the results from that study. But other than that, the pregnancy rates, the empty rates, they were all exactly the same across all the stocking rates. There was absolutely no difference in pregnancy rate, fertility performance, with the exception of the onset of heats, which were reduced at the higher stocking rates.
Yeah, my question is pretty much connected to that in terms of condition score, because there's a lot of preconception that you're underfeeding cows, and I mean I've done it all with high stocking rates, and it doesn't fit to the preconception there.
Yeah, the body condition score and body weight are reduced, but not detrimentally so. I suppose the big thing we know about body condition scores, we don't want to see large amounts of body condition score loss between calving and breeding, and that was the case in these studies. There was no major difference between treatments in terms of body condition score loss during the pre-breeding period, so that's why we had no detrimental effects.
Put your hand up now that we can get a pre-question, so we can get a microphone to you. Michael?
Thanks, Chairman. Michael Dorn from Wexford. The fragmented nature of Irish farms, and a question for Brendan, maybe Colin, I don't understand the nature of the industry in New Zealand, but how do we maximise that fragmented nature and utilise the grass that's on it? Like, how far can we push the stocking rate on a grazing platform if we have that fragmented farm and use the fragmented farms to feed the wedge if we're at deficit, or on the shoulders? Like, is there any work done on that of trying to integrate that fragmented holding and maximising the use of it besides getting rid of it? Like,
Yeah, we've done one big experiment in Ballyhaise looking at increasing the stocking rate on the milking platform to accommodate feed produced from an outside block of land. And the results were very, very disappointing. I suppose even with the best intentions in terms of grass utilisation and bringing in supplements from outside, supplementation of grazing is difficult. It's very difficult to do. You don't tend to get better grass utilisation at higher stocking rates when you're bringing in supplement from outside, because you're reducing animal requirements and so on. And economically, we got a reduction in farm profitability over I think it was 3 years or maybe 4 years that study was undertaken. So I don't have a good story for you in terms of using fragmented blocks. I suppose what I would say to you is that there's a couple of steps. If the block is quite small in proportion to the milking platform, it should be a heifer rearing enterprise. It could be used maybe for small amounts of something like that, to winter feed or whatever. If it's a big enough significant block, it needs to have milking cows on it to be a profitable unit. These in-between things, I suppose the principle I'd have, Michael, is that don't allow the milking platform at home to be influenced to any great degree by something outside. consolidate if you can.
Colin, I'll bring you on because it's regular enough practice in New Zealand. We'll say stock very high in the milking platform and move the cows off. Now coming from Michael's question, we're looking at whether we stock very high at home and just bring all the silage on. Same type of thing, only juggling it around. Your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I would totally agree with the comments from Brendan. Really, they're just as applicable here as they are in New Zealand, really. The further away the farm, then yes, it's more suited for heifer support or wintering operations. What we do see in New Zealand, and we've had a couple of farms in more remote regions where they've been not fragmented, but they've been very long farms. So that's where you've had, cows having to walk up to 5 kilometres from the dairy shed, so extreme long walking distances. And in those cases, that's where, if blocks are fragmented and you're needing to get to them, that's where once a day can be incredibly powerful. Getting cows, yes, you take a small hit in production from doing that, but at the same time, you've got quite a resilient system by, adopting once a day strategies for those fragmented blocks. So it can be quite a positive way of still doing it.
Okay. Anything else out there? Con, can you run, please, because we're short of time.
Johnny, I'll get you someday.
Yeah, and Pat O'Brien will give you instructions on marathons. He's over that way.
Just a question on the springtime in getting the residuals down to the really low levels of under 4 centimetres. At the high stocking rates, you will need to be supplementing with meal or some bit of silage. It's that, or do you just kind of go at it? How do you achieve that when you are supplementing a small bit? And add on to that, over time, can it be easier to achieve it, say, in your third year grazing down? Like in your first year trying to get down, right, is 4 centimetres just about achievable? Then second year, 3.5, then, in terms like that.
Yeah, there's definitely a conditioning effect of swards. There's lots of studies to show that in various guises, let's say. The longer you do it for, the easier it gets to do, for sure. I suppose at that time of the year, February and March, we're putting in small amounts of supplements to the animals anyway. Our focus in terms of the diet of those animals is that they're on a steadily rising plane of nutrition, albeit from a low level immediately post-calving. But we can assure, based on good controlled grazing allowances, that you're increasing, using the spring rotation planner, you're virtually assured that you're going to be increasing feed allowance to those animals each week right into breeding. And that's the real most important thing as far as I'm concerned in terms of feeding the cow properly in springtime.
I think probably all I can add to that is that it's not just the sward that's effectively being educated and developing over time. You're also teaching your cows to graze to that level. And that's not something that happens overnight, but consistent, regular grazing to low residuals, the cows adjust. They do it. But it's a matter of consistency. And if you can nail that, then that, as Brendan alluded to, that's an extra 200 kilograms of dry matter that you are accessing that you don't need to buy. So it's a big prize.
Comment on the following comment of the chairman. I think the ideal time is start in autumn. And you start grazing down properly in August, but that wouldn't say I'd wait till next August to do it. You have to do it when you have to do it. So if you intend to graze harder this spring, you start it right now. But in an ideal situation, if you start in the autumn, you've got your production and you start making those cows graze down, you're getting them used to it, you're starting your sward. Comment?
Yeah, it's the best time of the year, I suppose, if you're focusing on becoming more intensive in terms of grazing residual. I suppose the other thing I want to say is that at higher stocking rates, feed budgeting become more important and so on. And I think we've missed a little bit. A lot of the experiments we do at Moore Park, we graze to these kind of levels and we build big covers during winter to carry animals and feed animals properly in spring. That's really, really important. You can't be building these big feed covers on swards that are undergrazed in autumn. So absolutely, a big clean out in autumn is a starting point for grass quality for spring. The other thing is that there is a winter effect, that even swards that are hard to graze down in autumn, they do tend to break down during the winter. So they will be easier to graze in spring. That dormancy period does support more intensive grazing in the spring period. So you should have greater confidence to do it than you would achieve in the back end of the year.
Yeah, Gareth here again. Just a question for Colin, this would be, because you don't have the distances in Ireland. But when you're off wintering dairy cattle, I was over in America a couple of years ago, and there was a lot of research going into the effects of moving pregnant animals in late pregnancy on abortions and their reproductive performance. Have you seen anything detrimental in that way in New Zealand or not?
Look, there's no doubt that transporting stock right on calving can be detrimental. We certainly see instances of that in New Zealand. But look, it's still, in the overall scheme of things, I'd suggest to you it's not a major. You've still got a cow that's right on point of calving. If she's been effectively inducing herself in calving just a few days earlier, it's not a significant issue for us. It's not something we will be worried about necessarily in New Zealand. We would have cows coming home from winter grazing right on the point of calving. With heifers, we watch that a bit more closely. We'd like to get them home probably a week before calving start. And that helps also with training heifers, particularly through milking sheds as well, with just getting them home early and then whipping them through every day in the lead up to calving start anyway.
What sort of distances would those in-calf cows be travelling when you say coming home?
They wouldn't be being walked, they'll all be being transported, so it doesn't matter how far away they are. Usually they're on trucks for no more than half an hour anyway.
Yeah, a comment or a query for Brendan. On a growth, on the farm at home, we have a growth pattern very similar to the Ballyhays farm, where we are a very slow farm to grow in the spring, but with a very rapid peak in growth come mid-April and going into May. What's the best management practices to maximise high utilisation and time of calving for such a growth period?
So I suppose the two big things in Ballyhays are the wetter research farm in Teagasc. For those who aren't aware of it, it's that we tend to calve slightly later. It's difficult to get animals out onto swards. A lot of it is underwater in springtime, or there's parts of it underwater in springtime, so it's difficult to get cows out early. So we tend to calve slightly later, but we're still talking about the last days of February, mean calving date. The more important thing, I think, is that the rotation plan finishes early. The second rotation isn't delayed out into mid-April. We finished the first rotation on the 5th, 6th, 7th of April. If growth rate is going from a really low to a really high in a really short period of time, then the consequences of being too late getting into that second rotation are much more detrimental than they would be on a farm with a more slowly increasing growth rate. So being on top of farm cover, getting it right down right before the start of the second rotation is really critical to make sure the quality of the sward is held right through into the middle of the season. So that would be my biggest advice, would be to be sure to finish first rotation relatively early, graze out the farm as intensely as possible, and then be on top of that second rotation when the growth takes off.
Question for Colin. In terms of the decision rules around dealing with a deficit in the first rotation and in your mid-season, and you just might go through for a small deficit and a big deficit and differentiate them. Thank you.
And Kevin, go back a bit. What do you mean by small? In just the way you were saying
a small maybe. Colin, you talked about filling that, make a decision the wedge very quick. So I think you talked about slowing up the rotation of the cows. I think so that might have been I don't know if that's a response to a small deficit, but in a bigger one where there is feed probably required, or what makes that decision?
Certainly in terms of the small deficit, you're absolutely right. An early decision around slowing that rotation length is effectively a good decision. And what we typically see is that the difference between a small deficit and a large deficit, where your stocking rate's set appropriately in the first place, is timing. So if you're too late to recognise that you've been in a deficit position when you're starting on the spring rotation planner, then that deficit becomes quite significant later in the season, and that's where more significant quantities of feed are required to go in. So just to go back, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that when the cows are starting to calve, so when you're starting off on that spring rotation planner, if you can save just a few days in rotation at that point in time, that can be quite a significant quantum of feed by the time you're getting through and the use of that spring rotation planner, as you're getting further through the calving period. A large deficit, though, if you've got a large deficit, that's usually a signal that the decision's been too late in the first place. When you've got that, that's as soon as you recognise that, as soon as you can react as quickly as you possibly can, the better. But the golden rule that we have certainly in dairy holdings, is that where you've got a big deficit or a deficit, however significant it is, never, ever, ever speed up grazing rotation. So we would put feed in, and we might put in, we may even fill quite a significant portion of that feed deficit for a very short period of time, just to correct things to get through it as quickly as we possibly can. So the big thing is that it doesn't last too long. We would slow up rotation. So just bear in mind what I was saying, during the presentation. It's a matter of, he who dares wins. And so if you slow up early, you're effectively not adjusting intake or the amount of feed that's offered per day significantly at all. And if you get more favourable growing conditions than what you'd planned over that next period of time, you capture the full gain. Equally, if things don't recover, then you can still make calls about putting feed in, a little bit of feed in later. But it ends up being significantly less than it otherwise would have been, had you not slowed down your grazing rotation.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, 1 second. We might have a better question coming from somewhere else. Is there any question? Thank you. And you've got me out of trouble. Give him the mic before Michael Murphy, and then Michael, you'll come in next. No, the man back there with his hand up.
Very simple question, really. To get down to 3.5 centimetres, is it 12-hour blocks, is it 24-hour or 36-hour blocks?
It's at a maximum 12-hour block. Sometimes it's 3 or 4 hours if weather conditions permit. Sometimes back fences, sometimes not, depending on the weather conditions, but never more than 12 hours.
Certainly, I would agree in part with what Brendan's saying, except where you have large herds and you've got a lot of stock pressure within those herds, that's where in New Zealand, this is where we're dealing with feed deficits. So bear in mind, you've got to look at the context. So with a feed deficit, there we would look to utilise 24-hour grazing for a short period of time. What that does is, yes, it's potentially underfeeding stock a little through that period of time, but it's making sure that all animals in the herd get fully fed at least once per day, and that's quite key.
Yeah, Chairman, could I make a comment and ask the speakers then, would they agree or disagree that a high stocking rate, high utilisation system, that it's in practice at farm level, it is much easier to operate with much fewer decisions, but the few decisions that you have to make, such as, let's say, the actual targets at Magic Day, calving, closing up, and reverse Magic Day, that they have to be accurately identified and strictly adhered to. But other than that, we'll say the system is much, much simpler than situations, we'll say, that where you've constantly got to make decisions, in a lower stocking rate system.
Look, I can only agree really with the comment. Certainly higher stocking rate systems, hitting your targets, both covers and in terms of cow condition score, is so very, very fundamentally crucial. You miss those, you've got to take action early to correct it as quickly as you can. But once those targets are achieved, the simplicity around it is really key. And that's, I guess, with our model, that's the ability to replicate that at scale that's where the simplicity and the repeatability and the profitability all comes into it.
Yeah, I agree. I have nothing else to add. No.
Higher stocking rate easier.
Yeah, easier to manage, yeah.
Right. Thanks a million. We'll cut it. We'll make it very short. I think we should show our appreciation for two excellent speakers.